Hello, Acts of the Apostles. This is week 7, and this week we're going to talk about narrative criticism. Narrative criticism is different from what we've been doing in the past. In the past, we've been looking at questions of history and culture, and with narrative criticism, now we're going to look at the actual words of the text. What does the narrator say? What is the story of this text? And how does that story help us to understand what the narrator is trying to do in this text? The book that you're reading to learn about narrative criticism is by Mark Allen Powell, and it's called What is Narrative Criticism? It's part of a series of books that looks at what is and focuses on different kinds of biblical criticism. The narrative criticism book may feel a little daunting, but here's a hint. All of the information you need to know for exegesis is in the appendix. I've also put this on the forum, but I'm telling you this in the video in case you watch this video before you write your paper, as I know some of you do. All of your information is in the appendix of the book. And what the appendix of the book lays out for you is the 4 basic sets of questions that you want to ask about a New Testament text in order to do narrative criticism. The first set of questions have to do with the event being portrayed in that text. Questions about when it happened, why is it happening in a particular way, how does this event make meaning in this text. The second kinds of questions are about the characters in a particular biblical text. Who is named, who is not named, who's a stock character, who's a flat character, who's a round character. The third question are questions about the settings of the text. Where does this take place? Is it inside? Is it outside? Do we know? Does the setting matter? Does the setting not matter? How do we know? And the fourth question are overall characteristics of the text. Do we see irony? Do we see humor? Do we see rhetoric? Do we see kinds of symbolism that are being used over and over again? Do we see repetitions from previous parts of the text? How does this look in the whole text? So, narrative criticism looks at the text as a story. It does not look at the history of the text. It does not look at the social and culture of the text. Although, to be fair, narrative criticism is informed by the knowledge of these things. Folks who engage in narrative criticism often engage in narrative criticism not with this kind of naivete about the text, that they don't really know that there's a history here. They are engaging the history, but their focus is on the narrative. So here's what I'm asking you to do too. I'm asking you to engage the history, but focus on the narrative. In order to help you think about this, I'm actually going to do one for you. And I'm going to engage us in a reading of Acts chapter 14, verses 8 to 20. Acts chapter 14, verses 8 to 20. This is the story of the healing at Lystra. So let's take a look at the 4 different issues that narrative criticism looks at. First of all, event. What's the event in Acts chapter 14, verses 8 to 20? Well, according to the book of Acts, Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra. They've been chased out of Iconium by the Jews. That's how the narrator tells the story. The Jews, or the Judeans, have chased them out of Iconium. They're now in Lystra. They see a man who's been crippled from birth, and they look intently at him. Paul looks intently at him, sees that he's able to be healed, tells him to stand up. The man stands up. The people then engage Paul and Barnabas, calling them Zeus and Hermes. The priest of the temple of Zeus goes to find garlands to put them on Paul and Barnabas and to worship them as gods. Paul and Barnabas tear their clothes. They preach about the one true God of heaven and earth. Paul preaches about the one true God of heaven and earth. The people are barely restrained from turning them into gods, and then the Jews, or Judeans, from Iconium and Antioch show up. They change the crowd's mind. Paul ends up being stoned nearly to death. Then the disciples surround Paul and Barnabas, and Paul and Barnabas leave for Derbe. That's the whole story. That's the event. So the event is an event of a healing and a stoning, right? The event of a healing and a stoning. What do we know about this event as it functions in Acts of the Apostles? Well, first of all, this is the first work of power that we see Paul and Barnabas do after the narrator tells us that Paul and Barnabas are going to the Gentiles. In fact, this is the first real work of power we see Paul and Barnabas do at all in the entire text. So it's a very important text in that it shows Paul and Barnabas having the power to do miracles. It's the logical outworking of the narrative thus far. Paul and Barnabas, Paul is converted, Paul and Barnabas are commissioned, Paul goes out, therefore the next thing is they preach and they do miracles. It's a logical outworking. We've seen the same thing happen with Acts of the Apostles earlier. Peter and the disciples are commissioned, they get power, they go out, they preach, they work miracles, right? We've seen this happen before. So it's a logical outworking given this particular narrator. But there are also some things that are particular to the mission to the Gentiles. For instance, nowhere is Peter ever called Zeus or Hermes. And the reason for this is now we're talking about a mission to the Gentiles, not the Jews. So what the narrator is doing by making Paul and Barnabas into Zeus and Hermes in this text is to say, see, they're talking to Gentiles, not to Jews. It's kind of flashing the red sign, see, these are Gentiles, not Jews, because they believe in Zeus and Hermes. What's also interesting, given that, is that the narrator gives the Jews of Iconium and Antioch a lot of power over the Jews of Lystra, over the Gentiles of Lystra, which seems awfully strange since Jews were an oppressed minority in every city in the ancient world. So how Jews of Iconium and Antioch could have such power over Gentiles of Lystra is really quite questionable. But this is the way the narrator tells the story, and so this is how we are expected to understand the Jews if we're going to take this narrator seriously. We're going to talk about whether or not this narrator is trustworthy later. If we look at the way time functions in this narrative, it goes along normally. One thing follows after another until Paul starts speaking. And then it kind of slows down for Paul's speech. We all of a sudden get some real-time action with Paul's speech. And then it collapses upon itself. Sometime between Paul's speech and Paul being stoned, Jews show up from Iconium to Antioch. There's some travel involved, but we don't see that happen. We just all of a sudden see, but the Jews showed up and they stoned them. So time functions very strangely in this text. It kind of goes along normally, then Paul speaks, it kind of stops, and then it kind of speeds rapidly up and collapses upon itself. There's a stoning, and then it moves on again as if nothing has happened, which is very strange. Obviously, this story comes just after Paul is set aside, and it is intentionally a parallel to another story that we've read earlier. It's a parallel to Acts 3, when Peter, James, and John are going up to the temple and see the lame man at the beautiful gate, right? This is a clear parallel to say, see, Paul has the same authority and power as Peter. This is setting something up in Acts chapter 15, which is something we're going to read about this week, the Jerusalem conference, the question as to whether or not Paul and Barnabas have a valid mission. So you've got evidence that Paul and Barnabas' mission are identical to Peter's mission in the ways in which they lay out, in the ways in which they work power, in the ways in which they preach. There are two levels of conflict here. There's a conflict between monotheism and polytheism, and Paul and Barnabas, interestingly, are on the side of monotheism, but they're on the side of monotheism and they don't even mention Jesus in this. They mention Jesus in the previous speech when they're speaking to the Jews of Iconium, but when they're speaking to the Gentiles of Lystra, Jesus doesn't even come up. So this is really an argument about monotheism. The second conflict is the conflict between the Jews and Paul, a conflict that doesn't get resolved until Acts 15, because at the end of this narrative, it ends with Paul being nearly stoned to death and then having to leave for Derbe. So you've got the wonder-working power of Paul and his effectiveness and divine blessing and the way in which he's able to speak to the Gentiles and be heard by the Gentiles, and that's setting something up. Who are the characters in the story? Let's move to the question of characters. So the characters are Paul and Barnabas, the man crippled from birth, the crowd is always a character, the priest of Zeus, the Judeans from Antioch and Iconium, and the disciples. All of these are characters in the story. Now we've seen in the narrative from the New Testament, Paul, Barnabas, and the Judeans from Antioch before. These are all characters that are following through in the narrative. The ones that are new are the crowd of Lystra, the priest of Zeus, and the disciples of Lystra, who only appear as character groups that fulfill single roles and then disappear. The crowd's only role is to be swayed either by Paul or by the Jews of Antioch and Iconium. Their only role is to be fickle. The priest of Zeus is there to represent polytheistic worship, belief in the gods. The disciples are to represent the Christian community that are loyal to Paul but not terribly powerful, can't stop him from being stoned. Now, the narrator, as I said, has already told us about Paul and Barnabas and the Judeans. None of the other characters speak. In fact, the only person who speaks in this entire narrative is Paul. And he speaks, this is his second speech. His first speech is to the Jews of Iconium. The second speech now is to Lystra. And as I said before, Jesus doesn't show up at all in this speech. This speech is all about the one God that you can know about from the signs and how you shouldn't be worshiping gods. It has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus, which is really interesting. So Paul actually has two separate messages, one to Jews and one to Gentiles, as we begin to see in this text. Let's summarize a bit the traits of the characters. The Gentiles, if you trust this narrator, according to this narrator, the Gentiles are pagan, fickle, and gullible. If you trust this narrator, the Jews are jealous and lying. If you trust this narrator, Paul and Barnabas are innocent and long-suffering. And if you trust this narrator, the disciples are faithful but cowardly. So here you've got the narrator setting up four different kinds of people, right? Paul and Barnabas, the noble, long-suffering martyrs for the faith. The disciples, the scared, cowardly, but loyal. The Jews, who are obviously evil and fickle, mean and jealous. And then the crowd that's fickle and is going to go whichever way the crowd wants to go. Again, the question becomes, can you trust the narrator? Is the narrator telling a fair story or a true story? Because you see, this sort of thing sets up questions of ideology, which we read earlier. This sets up questions of what is the narrator's agenda. Let's look at a question of setting. Spatially, the story happens inside the city of Lystra, because the priest of Zeus goes outside of the city to get garlands from the temple. Lystra is a city in Galatia. It figures twice in Acts, once here and once when Paul picks up Timothy in Lystra. And Timothy, as you know, is the son of a Jewish woman and a pagan man, which raises the question whether or not the people that Paul is talking to are all entirely pagans or whether or not there's a mixed crowd, but that's another question. Given the fact that Paul and Barnabas are outside, we have very little spatial or temporal information. We don't know if they're on a street, we don't know if they're in an agora, we don't know if they're in a temple, we don't know if they're in a synagogue, we don't know if they're in a house, we don't know where they are exactly. We only know that there are stones nearby because Paul gets stoned. So we don't know where spatially this happens. Now compare that to the story of Paul's conversion, where Ananias is told, go to a street called Straight. That's a very clear spatial designation. It tells you you're inside a particular city and you're looking for a particular street. The narrator expects the readers to know who these Judeans or Jews are and why they have such power over Zeus worshippers, which really is unusual. The narrator expects the readers will understand that the priest of Zeus, in bringing garlands, is treating Paul and Barnabas as living statues of Zeus and Hermes. And the narrator expects us to understand what it means to tear clothing and the impact of being stoned by your own people, the shame of this. And again, the narrator is intentionally paralleling Paul's early ministry and Peter's early ministry. He's trying to set up, this narrator, this argument that Paul and Peter are equivalent, and then the rest of Acts is going to be about Paul. So what are the overall narrative questions? Well, the author is trying to convince his Theophilus, his audience, that the Jews are so unreasonable that they can't even abide Paul teaching monotheism to the Gentiles, which is something they should agree on. That's a really horrible way to set up your opponents, but he's setting up his opponents in a particular way. And the reason I say it's horrible is that, remember, the Christian church then becomes powerful, and these sorts of arguments become the reason for the Holocaust. So everything we do ends up coming back to bite us later on in the history of the church. Meanwhile, Paul's stoning is reinterpreted by the narrator in 1422 that this is somehow the work of discipleship, and the work of discipleship is suffering. And that is an echo going back in the text to 9:16, where Ananias is to tell Paul, or God is going to tell Paul through Ananias how much he has to suffer for the gospel. So Paul's honor is preserved, even though he should be dishonored by being stoned by his own people, because he is suffering for the gospel, which we have already been told by the narrator is part of Paul's job. So again, you see how the narrator is setting us up. The narrative is intended to move the readers in sympathy to Paul and Barnabas, who are supposed to be full of integrity, and to move the readers to be against the Jews and in suspicion of the crowds. This is going to set up the rest of the Acts narrative. So I hope you see how narrative criticism helps you to unpack a text a little bit and to see what's there. That doesn't mean it's going to help you to come to a conclusion about the text, but at least it helps you to understand what the narrator is up to and what the narrator is trying to get the implied readers to understand. Given that, go back and think about the ideology of the text again. Who is silenced and who speaks? How might this text be told differently if the Jews were telling the story rather than Paul was telling the story? How might it be told differently if the crowds were telling the story? Or the man who is healed and then disappeared and nobody hears from him again and we know nothing about him. We don't even know his name. He's just there as a stock figure to make a point that Paul has power. So let's think about these texts in a narrative way. Go back and take a look at the appendix. I look forward to reading your papers, and I will see you in the forum. Take care.